It's really a great pleasure to be able to come and share some thoughts with you all today. And there will be some time for some questions at the end as well. I don't have a set of prepared remarks. I thought about drafting a very polished set piece, and I actually thought, in some sense, a more conversational approach might actually work better. So what I do envisage to do today is to step through three key themes globally and then focus in on some of the domestic issues we're grappling with here at the bank. The first global issue is the pace of the recovery. And what we've seen so far globally is it's been very uneven. So in a number of advanced economies, we've seen a pretty rapid recovery in growth. You can see those arrows are suggesting that, well, they're telling us that a number of advanced economies have got a level of output that's actually higher than before the pandemic now. For emerging markets, the picture is more mixed. In some cases, worse health outcomes. In many cases, far less generous policy support, or at least a more constrained policy environment, has meant that a number of economies in the emerging markets are struggling to get back above their pre-pandemic levels of output and activity. So the picture is quite mixed. I think it is reasonable to say, though, for many advanced economies, we expect them to be back on their pre-pandemic trajectories sometime next year. The second theme globally, and Phil just alluded to it there, is the upswing in inflation. We're seeing it in a number of advanced economies. We're seeing it to an extent we haven't seen for many years. It's largely showing up in headline inflation, but in some countries we're also seeing an upswing in underlying measures of inflation. I'll come back to that a little later. And of course, the increase in commodity prices is part of what's going on here. Effectively, as the governor just articulated, what we are observing is a very large substitution of consumption into goods away from services during the pandemic. And that's creating some pretty persistent capacity constraints in global goods markets. It's also now starting to strain transport networks. You see the bottom right-hand corner of that quadrant. Shipping costs, for instance, are up, fivefold, for instance. So it's both the goods prices themselves, with the additional overlay now of transport networks really straining, and those two things together are amplifying or exacerbating some of the price pressures, particularly upstream price pressures, and in the goods market in particular. That's really where the pressures are most acute. There's also been some disruptions to global energy markets, and that has increased the cost of production, for instance, of certain energy-intensive commodities like base metals. So there's been a lot going on in this space, but overwhelmingly, the forces at play have been huge substitution effect into global goods, and a system that hasn't been able to produce enough of those goods and to ship and transport those goods quickly enough to ameliorate the price pressures. Our sort of base case presumes that these price pressures do start to fade next year as consumers go back to spending more on services. But I think we do have to acknowledge that some of these price pressures have been a bit more persistent. Certainly globally, most central banks have noted that they have been more persistent than what was originally envisaged. And partly reflecting the increase in actual inflation outcomes, we're now starting to see measures of inflation expectations start to pick up. Now, some context is important here because this pickup, first of all, is from very low levels. from very low levels indeed. Early on in the pandemic, these market implied and survey implied measures of inflation expectations were about as low as they've ever been. So there's been a bit of a snapback there. And the other thing to keep in mind here is these measures of inflation expectations in the main are just getting back toward levels that are consistent with central bank targets. So we're not seeing a huge sort of a runaway or an overshoot of inflation expectations. We are seeing an increase, but it's back toward levels that central banks would typically like to see actual inflation outcomes print at. Our third global theme has been recent developments in China. And I think the broad takeaway I would leave you with there is simply that the outlook is more uncertain than it has been for some time in China. And that's, now the future is always uncertain, of course, but notwithstanding that, what we are observing in China is a lot of policy levers being pulled at the same time on the economic front and the financial system in terms of social policy. Politically, there's a lot in play at the moment. And so I think that the outlook for output over the medium term in China is just a bit more uncertain than it has been in some time. One area where we're seeing a fairly meaningful adjustment now is in the construction and especially in the property sector. This is partly the result of policy measures designed to take some of the heat out of these markets. And also more generally, there is a pretty concerted effort underway in China to get on top of some of the burgeoning risks to financial stability that were starting to reveal themselves, in particular in the property development space. I'm sure you've all heard of the case of Evergrande, which is currently going through a very challenging period. But the key point to keep in mind here is this is in large part an engineered outcome. This is not sort of the result of market forces doing their thing. I mean, policymakers have been trying to clamp down some of the excesses in this part of the economy. And one thing that they're not doing yet, at least, which you have seen historically when the property market has slowed, is a rapid easing in credit conditions or a rapid easing in fiscal settings, in particular by local governments. Traditionally, if growth or activity slowed in China, quite often you've seen the authorities look to credit easing or easing of financial conditions to sort of get the cycle moving again. That's not happening. It hasn't happened yet this cycle, at least. As I said, a key difference is the tightening is exactly what the Chinese authorities are trying to achieve here. So this slowdown that we're seeing in parts of the property market and some other parts of the economy, we're not expecting a rapid turnaround anytime soon. So they're the three sort of global themes that we've been following. That is the uneven global recovery, the upswing in global inflation, and the slowdown in China. So let me move on now to the domestic outlook. And just before I get to the domestic outlook, our assessment of current conditions. So if I take you back to June or back to August, around the middle of the year, the economy looked to be recovering very rapidly. We had exceeded the pre-pandemic level of output, shown here by the purple line. The economy was then obviously subjected to another very severe shock in the Delta outbreak. That set back the recovery. You can see that in the September quarter, we're expecting a contraction of around 3% or so. It's a setback, but it hasn't derailed the recovery. And the preliminary data, the high frequency data that we monitor, are giving us a lot of confidence that the economy probably leveled out, started to stabilize in the month of September. And that has set the foundation for a very strong recovery in the current quarter and into the March quarter next year. And so we think that by around the middle of next year, the economy will be traveling along the trajectory we thought a few months ago. So it is a setback, quite sizable setback. I mean, any other time in our history, a 3% contraction in quarterly GDP would be a very material event. But we think that the foundations are in place for a quick rebound, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, I mentioned at the outset, one of the key global themes we've been following has been the unevenness in the recovery. It's also been evident domestically, and it's been evident across states and across industries. I've shown here retail sales values here. It's just one. I could have chosen 10 other charts to make the same point. Some states that have got through the past year or so without too challenging health outcomes, places like WA and Queensland, South Australia, you can see retail sales values are significantly above where they were prior to the pandemic. In parts of the country where you've had significant disruptions, in particular to consumption and the consumption of services in particular, that's where you've seen relative underperformance, so to speak, certainly in terms of consumption activity in general. And that's been the story for New South Wales and Victoria, particularly since the Delta outbreak. Now, I mentioned that we, as bad as the September quarter was, we're expecting a pretty rapid rebound in the current quarter and in the March quarter. Part of the reason for that expectation is that business confidence has come back very strongly, including in those states that were subjected to lockdown. So firms in Victoria and New South Wales have been telling us, they've been doing it tough over the last few months. However, they can see a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think what was really important here in terms of that light appearing at the end of the tunnel was the laying out of the roadmaps by individual states. Once we saw some clarity emerge around those roadmaps, we saw business confidence start to lift. And given that firms were already reporting very strong conditions up until June, and they were some firms and some industries telling us they're having difficulties finding enough labour, and that conditions were very tight, that capacity utilisation was very high. They have been prepared to basically look through the Delta outbreak and not take a sledgehammer to investment and their hiring intentions. They've been through a period like this last year. They kind of, I think, feel quite battle hardened, and so that has given us a basis for thinking that there's going to be a pretty swift recovery on the other side of the Delta outbreak. Another, turning to the labour market now, another thing that gave us some confidence that we would come out of the Delta outbreak in reasonable shape was that in the lockdowns last year, we saw a very large adjustment to hours worked, much more so than in terms of employment, or as we say here, heads. There was clearly some adjustment to overall headcount levels, but the main margin of adjustment is that firms reduced the hours their employees were on. I think this has become, you can see the figure most recently in New South Wales has been really striking, that decline in hours worked. What firms learned from the lockdowns last year is when you come out of this, you're going to need a workforce in place, and it's very difficult to be trying to hire again when everyone else is doing exactly the same thing. And so given the choice, firms have looked to put workers on reduced hours, or in some cases cut their hours altogether, but maintain some level of attachment, knowing full well that at some point they're going to need to hire back those workers, and they don't want to be doing it when everyone else is trying to do exactly the same thing. Now, I mentioned the unevenness of the recovery being a key theme globally and domestically, and here's, I think, a really stark way of highlighting this. So this shows the cumulative decline in payroll jobs across different industries. During the first lockdown, which is shown in the left panel, and the more recent, the Delta outbreak in the right panel, what you can see there very clearly is that for the in-person services industries, accommodation, food, so on, they've seen a significant reduction in jobs. Those jobs in those industries fell by about 1/3 in the lockdowns last year. This time around, they've fallen by about 20%. But at the same time, there's been some industries, most notably professional services, shown here in green, and finance, insurance, where actually the number of jobs has gone up. And so this is it's been a really unusual, period because of the really uneven outcomes, both for industries and sectors. Some have done very well. Some have had a good pandemic, and others have been really crunched very, very hard during this period. Now, the unemployment rate has been an interesting one, and probably a curious one for some of you or some of your students recently. How is it that the unemployment rate has gone down when employment and hours and everything else you look at has tanked? It's a reasonable question, but it's largely got to do with measurement issues. It's basically, in short, what it reflects is that we had a big decline in participation. So people basically stopped looking for work. They moved straight out of employment, straight out of the labour force. They didn't spend any time in between unemployed looking for a job. Some workers over this period have stayed attached to their employers, even though they haven't been getting paid, and they've been working 0 hours. They've been out of the labour force. There was also a suspension of mutual obligation requirements for people during the lockdowns to access support, like the job seeker support payment. So basically, people were, you had this huge wave of people who moved from employment straight out of the labour force. They're going to come back now. And in fact, in the LFS release last week, we saw the first signs of that. And that's why, although we think that fundamentally the labour market is now starting to heal, the unemployment rate is actually going up a bit. It's not entirely unexpected, and it's really just got to do with the fact that that huge wave of people moving out of the labour force are now coming back into the labour force. So that the unemployment rate may do some strange things over the next few months. Our sense is that once we're on the other side of the new year, things should settle down again, and the unemployment rate will go back to giving us a reliable read on what's actually happening in the labour market. But for now, this is one of those periods where you can be telling your students that swings in participation are really, really important. It's not just employment; it's also swings in participation that can have a big and sometimes counterintuitive effect on the unemployment rate. And so, turning to our forecasts, we're expecting a pretty steady decline in the unemployment rate over the next couple of years. Essentially, if you look at our profile for activity, which I showed a few slides earlier, we're looking at very, very strong rebound next year in percentage terms. A more moderate rate of growth in 2023. That is going to help generate solid levels of employment growth and drive down the unemployment rate toward levels that we haven't seen too often in Australia in the last half century. And one of the big, I think, implications for having such a low unemployment rate is going to be what does this mean for wages and ultimately inflation? Now, in our central scenario, we've got wages growth gradually picking up from what's been the lowest rate in the 23-year history of this series, picking up over the next couple of years from a little below 2% where it is today to around 3% by the end of 2023. You may be asking, why is the other measure in there in the blue line, the average earnings per hour, why is that running a little stronger than the wage price index? Well, these two measures of wages and labour costs they're measuring slightly different things. The WPI controls for compositional changes in the labour force, so it's looking at the same pool of jobs each quarter. Average earnings per hour is a broader measure of labour costs. It is impacted by changes in the types of jobs, and it's also going to pick up the increase in the superannuation guarantee, which will start to take effect in the September quarter, and basically result in this measure, what we call AENA, running at about 1/4 point stronger than the WPI. There's a small element of that is just a cyclical piece. Quite often when the labour market's running hot, AENA runs a little bit stronger than the WPI because it is picking up compositional change, people moving to jobs that are paying higher wages, but it's also reflecting the superannuation guarantee increase. So I think we can say that what our projections are in the central scenario for labour costs to be increasing at about 3% a year over the forecast period. Now, one thing we're watching very carefully is the disaggregated data. So when we look under the aggregate hood, we look to see how many jobs are paying wages growth rates of 0 to 2% or 2 to 3 or higher than 3. What you see with the grey bars here is that up until 2012-13, you had a lot of jobs paying sort of plus 3% wages growth. Right? That's the story here. Just ahead of the pandemic, very, very few jobs were paying wages growth of, we're experiencing wages growth in excess of 3%. So there was a big distributional shift downward. Most jobs were, we saw wages growth of 0 to 2 or 2 to 3 just before the pandemic. Very different profile. As wages growth in aggregate picks up, what we will have to see for that to bear out is a rising share of jobs where wages growth is higher than 2%, obviously. Now, how quickly we go back to the sort of 2000 to 2013 period, there is some uncertainty about that. We're not expecting a rapid return. There's a lot of inertia in the wage setting methods in Australia, which means we think this will happen at a measured pace, but the direction of travel is up. Now, I just slipped this slide in because I'm sure you're hearing and reading reports of the Great Resignation in the United States. So the ABS has a similar series. I'd refer you just to the blue line here. The bottom line is we're not seeing yet, at least, the same sort of phenomena that we're seeing in the United States. What we saw last year was a big spike in involuntary, if you like, people leaving their jobs for involuntary reasons. That's a euphemism for basically being laid off. And more recently, what we've seen is we have seen an uptick in people who have left their jobs in the last 3 months because they wanted to change or in search of a better job. But that was after an earlier fall. So if you kind of smooth through that series, there's not a whole lot going on. We would expect as the labour market tightens that that series should pick up further. But the main point I wanted to leave you with is unlike the United States, where labour market conditions are very, very hot at the moment, we're just not seeing the same sort of dynamics. And wages growth is a great way of, I think, bringing that out. So in Australia, the last reading on our WPI was below 2%. In the United States now, they've got wages growth, actually, depending on your measure, at 4, 5, 5.5%. The UK is another that's seeing wages growth headed toward 4%. We're an order of magnitude below that, and that is a key reason why the bank's forecasts for inflation are where they are, which is that we do expect an upswing, but we expect it to be gradual, partly because we expect the uplift in wages growth to be gradual as well. And why is this? Well, I mentioned before the inertia in our pay setting methods being one reason, but if you just have a look at some of these labour markets internationally, what we are seeing is the unemployment rates have come down, but employment is still well below pre-pandemic levels. And so how is this resulting in wages growth? Well, it's because people have not returned to the labour market in economies like the United States and the United Kingdom. There, what we're seeing is basically a cohort of people who left the labour force during the pandemic have just not come back. And so you're seeing wages pressure in those economies, despite the level of employment being below where it was prior to the pandemic. And so a key source of uncertainty for those economies is, does this pool of labour that left the labour force in part to do home caring, the data that we have access to suggesting that in the United States, there are a large number of females in particular, much less so males, who left the labour force during the onset of the pandemic and never came back. Now that schools have gone back in the United States and the United Kingdom, we'd expect to see some portion of those folks who left the labour market re-enter the labour force. But until they do, it's hard to see that this pressure on wages in some of these economies is going to dissipate anytime soon. And so putting together a picture where we've got the output increasing pretty strongly next year, and that increasing at a more moderate pace, broadly in line with the long-term pre-pandemic trends in 2023. That feeding through to a lower rate of unemployment, getting down toward levels of unemployment that we haven't observed. Well, if you go back to the early 1970s, there was a brief period before the global financial crisis where in Australia we had an unemployment rate in the low 4s. Outside of that brief period, that 18-month period, you've got to go back to the early 70s. So we're going to have a tightening labour market. That's going to put upward pressure on wages and ultimately lead to upward pressure on underlying inflation. But as shown here, it's gradual. We don't see inflation, tearing higher. In the last quarter, underlying inflation came in at 2.1%. It was the first time in a number of years that underlying inflation has been back in the band. That's a good thing. We expect that inflation will remain around 2.25% for a lot of the forecast period, and later on toward the end of 2023, start to pick up toward 2.5% as you see wages growth start to accelerate. Now, one of the things that really struck us in the recent September quarter CPI was building cost inflation. This is a key part of the CPI index. It was basically running as hot as it has since the 1980s, which you can see in this top panel here. And that's really reflecting a couple of things. One is imported goods prices, things like materials like timber and steel in short supply globally. And so the domestic construction industry has had to pay more to bring those materials into the country. And on top of that, there's just been very strong demand. in the construction industry in general, and a lot of the state and federal government support packages have fueled that demand. So very strong domestically sourced demand for construction, for building activity, combined with imported materials prices increasing pretty strongly, meant that we had very big increase in building cost inflation, and that was why we got effectively the upside surprise on the most recent inflation outcome. Now we think this part of the economy is going to remain pretty tight, and there's going to be price pressures in this part of the economy for a little period yet. But as we look further into next year, these effects should start to abate, and it will be more wages growth picking up that supports that uplift in inflation in 2023. So let me conclude here. This shows you the expected policy rate projections that are embedded in financial market pricing. As you can see, I mean, the main story is that, well, in fact, I think there's two takeaways from this final slide. One is that central banks everywhere are expected to start lifting rates next year. Some have actually already started, but markets are assuming everyone pretty much other than the Japanese gets going next year on a tightening cycle. Now, the governor's made a number of remarks about why we don't think that will happen in Australia next year. In 2023, it's a plausible possibility that it happens. That the central scenario those would suggest that 2022 is extremely unlikely. The other takeaway from this is that the terminal rate, so to speak, that the final level of central bank policy rates that financial markets expect central banks to take rates to is quite low relative to historical norms. And what this is reflecting is that estimates of the long-term neutral interest rate, the rate that's neither stimulative or contractionary for the economy, has just been revised down pretty consistently over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And so effectively what the markets are saying is there'll be a pretty steep lift off next year for a number of central banks, but that ultimately rates are not going to go that high in the current cycle. Part of that is because the neutral rate is expected to be lower than it was previously, and also that some of these price pressures that we're seeing are not going to persist for all that long. And so with a burst of tightening, that will probably be all that's required to keep inflation around where central banks would like it to be.